Now we return to China with the Ming Dynasty. And if you look, there's probably about a 300-year period of relative stability with Ming China. But remember that it doesn't emerge out of stability. In fact, the stability is a reflection of the fact that China has some of the most chaotic years in its entire existence immediately preceding the Ming. And that's saying something, considering that at various points in Chinese history, China disintegrates into 10 warring kingdoms. So if we go back to the Yuan dynasty, remember the Yuan dynasty basically treated Chinese people as second-class citizens in their own country. Especially if you were Southern Chinese. In other words, if you're a Chinese person from the core holdings of what was the Song dynasty. The Ming dynasty was founded by Zhu Yongzhang, who was a military commander of just peasant origins. And remember, during this time period, it's almost like China goes through this period of proto-nationalism. You have the emergence of societies that are designed to resist the Mongols, like the White Lotus Society, for example. Zhu Yuanzhang kind of comes out of this sort of atmosphere, as it were. He alternated between begging and living in a monastery just to survive. In the 1340s, Zhu left the monastery, and like many people, he joined the rebellion against the Mongols. Eventually, because of his abilities, he is given small armies to run, and eventually his armies overthrow the Mongols and take back most of China. In 1368, so about after 20 years of almost constant resistance, Shu declares himself the Hongwu Emperor, and basically the goal of everything is to return China back to the point that it was before the Mongol invasion. So, for example, we have the return of traditional Chinese imperial clothing, names, architecture. We also have the transfer of the capital from the old Mongol capital of Beijing to the more southern capital of Nanjing. Now, Hongwu, seen here with his butt cap, um, was interested in restoring China as it was, but he also was a student of history and realized where China, let's say, could use some significant improvement, especially in the bureaucracy. So, yes, the Neo-Confucians come back because of their resistance to the Mongols, and they increase their influence by supporting obedience to the state. Of course, any increase in influence is going to be inevitable since during the Mongols, remember, their influence was practically zero. But Hongwu actually tried to limit the influence of the bureaucrats because he recognized that the Song definitely overcorrected there. So he abolishes the position of chief minister, and basically he becomes his own chief minister. Documents that were considered a threat were censored, and those acts of censorship were sanctioned by Hongwu. Ming rulers like Hongwu actively encouraged the restoration of Confucianism and Confucian ideals, and bureaucrats and people in general were impressed to be honest, loyal, and virtuous. And there are some high stakes performance reviews that are apparently instituted. You have public beatings that are given to bureaucrats that are found guilty of corruption or just being really sucky at their job. Hongwu also really likes centralizing power. He keeps all his power hidden underneath his butt cap. So Hongwu also dictates that all the emperor's wives should come from humble origins, so that way you don't have a bunch of court factionalism over which faction is the emperor going to marry into. Hongwu used his eunuchs as basically like his spies, his eyes and ears. And finally, potential rivals to Hongwu were exiled to estates in the provinces. So on the one hand, Hongwu wants to move away from Confucian bureaucrats because they're really expensive, they're high maintenance, and they tend to hog power. At the same time, he can't really figure out a way to run a modern state without them. So, like, there are bills that have to be paid, dams that have to be built, farms that have to be plowed. So, at the end of it all, he is forced to re-embrace Confucian bureaucracy. So we have the reemergence of the scholar bureaucracy taking tests based on merit. And let me tell you about the test taking experience from hell. So each candidate can have the opportunity to take an exam every 3 years. So they competed for degrees. There were about 4,000 candidates that competed for over 150 degrees, by the way. And each candidate was given a large, cubicle where they could eat and sleep and answer questions, and they weren't allowed to leave until they were done. Women could still not take the exam, and you do see the restoration of imperial academies and regional colleges. Sometimes what you want is not necessarily what you get. Hung Wu wants to basically work with the peasants and improve their lives because, let's face it, during the last couple of centuries of Chinese history, the peasants have had it really rough under Mongol rule. And by the way, the peasants have never had it exactly great to begin with. So you start to see the emergence of things like public works, the apportioning of new lands, lowering forced labor demands, in other words, lowering de facto slavery, and promoting middle-class handicraft industries. Unfortunately, rural landlords tended to ally themselves with bureaucrats, and they sort of conspire to shut the peasants out. Peasants, even though they're supposed to be the beneficiaries of all these new reforms, they basically become just tenant farmers of landlords. And so during the Ming Dynasty, you have a growing gap between the wealthy and the poor, unfortunately. And with the emergence of Neo-Confucianism, we also have the sidelining of women. So women continue to be subordinate to men, but in the Ming Dynasty, let's say they are more subordinate to men. So you do have at least a silver lining in the high social status of elite women who could try to basically manipulate power through husbands and sons, but no direct pathway to power. So as for the social status of non-elite women, basically they need to bear sons in order to have respect and status. So Hong Wu more or less successfully purges China of Mongol influences. But what he should have been worried about are influences of a different kind. Influences from Europe. And that is where we'll pick up next time.